I'll be the first to admit that things weren't always thrilling between me and Sarah. After 10 years of marriage, the monotony of routine had set in like the daily morning alarm. I was fine with that though, happy even. We had our 2 kids, Emily and Max, and to me, that was what life was about. I just figured Sarah and I were comfortable, content. But looking back now, maybe I was blind to how restless she'd become. It started a few months ago. Sarah was volunteering at our kids' school, where Max had just started kindergarten. I'd always admired how dedicated she was as a mother, always pitching in, helping out at events, and making sure our kids felt at home at school. It seemed like her thing, you know? I worked long hours and wasn't around as much as I wanted to be, so having her there gave me some peace of mind. After a while, though, she began spending more time than usual at the school. Every other day, it seemed like she was heading out for one meeting or another. "It's for the kids' sake," she'd say, brushing off my half-joking comments about how she was practically on the payroll. And when I'd laugh, her smile looked different, a little too careful, too composed. The man at the centre of all these school meetings and gatherings, Principal Riley. I'd only met him briefly, and he struck me as the serious, professional type, polished, polite, a little too charming, but overall harmless. He was someone who knew how to handle a PTA meeting without letting it devolve into chaos. Sarah would occasionally talk about him, how dedicated he was, how much he cared about the school and the kids. I shrugged it off as harmless admiration. But something changed. One night, Sarah was at the school late, helping Principal Riley set up for a big fundraiser. Emily and Max had gone to bed hours ago, and I found myself restlessly pacing the kitchen, glancing at the clock every few minutes. When I finally heard the garage door open, I straightened up, expecting to see her rush in with the usual chaotic energy she carried. Instead, she walked in slowly, almost hesitantly, her face flushed. "Hey," I greeted her, trying to act casual as she slipped off her shoes. "Oh, hey," she replied, her voice light, but with a distracted edge. She kept looking down, fumbling with her keys as she put them away. I walked over, leaning against the counter, watching her. "Long night?" She nodded, not meeting my eyes. "Yeah, a lot of last-minute stuff to set up. Principal Riley had 1,000 things on his checklist, and we just got to talking about it all." "Talking? Until almost midnight?" I asked, trying to keep the tone light. But the knot in my stomach was tightening. "Oh, you know how it is," she said, finally glancing up at me with a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "School stuff can take a lot longer than you think." Her words felt hollow. After that night, things didn't just settle down, they got stranger. Sarah would brush off the time she spent at school, chalking it up to last-minute fundraising efforts or prepping for the new semester. She had more PTA events than I'd ever heard of, and when I casually asked about it, she'd say, "You'd be surprised at the workload Principal Riley takes on alone. The least I can do is help." It seemed innocent enough at first, but those late nights began happening more frequently. Every time she came home, her cheeks were flushed, and she had this faraway look in her eyes that I couldn't place. When I brought it up, she'd brush it off, saying, "It's nothing. Really, you're making a big deal out of nothing." Then, one evening, I decided to swing by the school and see what was keeping her so busy. I told myself it was just curiosity. I wasn't jealous or suspicious, just a husband who hadn't seen his wife at a normal hour in weeks. The school parking lot was practically empty, except for a few cars scattered around. But hers was right up front, alongside another black sedan. I recognized it immediately, Principal Riley's car. I parked at a distance, watching the building, unsure of what exactly I was looking for. After a few minutes, I saw the two of them walking out of the side entrance, laughing quietly. I ducked down, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't even explain. The way they walked together, it felt intimate. Riley reached out, brushing his hand against her arm as they said goodbye. Sarah looked up at him, her expression unreadable, but the way she lingered made my stomach twist. I went home, trying to shake off what I'd seen, rationalizing it all away. They're just friends, I told myself. She's been working with him constantly. Of course they'd be comfortable around each other. But as the days passed, my mind wouldn't let it go. The late nights, the secretive smiles, the way she seemed more distracted around me, it was all starting to pile up. Then the texts began. One night, she left her phone on the kitchen counter as she went to tuck Max into bed. I glanced over, and there it was. A message from someone saved in her contacts as JT. I don't know why, but something in me snapped. I reached for the phone and opened it just to check. The latest message read, "Tonight was wonderful. You're incredible, Sarah." My hands went numb as I scrolled up. Most of the previous texts were either short, vague responses or inside jokes I didn't understand. But the way they spoke to each other, it wasn't just professional, it wasn't just friendly, it felt personal. When she returned, I handed her phone back without a word. I watched her face closely, looking for any hint of guilt or surprise, but she just took it with a small smile and went to wash up. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with every possible explanation, each one darker than the last. A few days later, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I had to confront her. "Sarah," I started, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to keep calm. "Are you hiding something from me?" She froze, looking up from her laptop with wide eyes. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I don't know. You just seem distant lately. All these late nights at the school, the texts." I trailed off, not even sure how to finish. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face unreadable. Then she sighed, closing her laptop and looking me straight in the eye. "This is about Riley, isn't it?" I didn't say anything. She shook her head, running a hand through her hair. "We're friends, okay? He's going through a lot. His wife left him a few months ago, and I'm just being there for him." Her words stung, but her explanation made sense. I wanted to believe her desperately, but part of me wondered why she hadn't told me about his wife or the late-night conversations before. It felt like too much too late. "Look," she said, reaching out to hold my hand. "I'm sorry if I've made you feel like you don't matter. You're the only one for me. All this is just, it's work, and maybe I got too involved. But it's nothing more than that." I nodded, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. Something still felt wrong. But I decided to let it go, hoping things would go back to normal on their own. It wasn't until the following week, when I received an anonymous email, that I knew I'd been right to worry all along. The email arrived late on a Thursday night. I was alone in the living room, idly scrolling through work emails, when it popped up in my inbox with the subject line, "What your wife hasn't told you." My heart stopped as I stared at it, not daring to open it right away. Who could it be? Was it some kind of spam or, worse, a scam? I almost deleted it without reading, but a strange pull kept my finger hovering over the screen. I clicked it open. "You don't know me, but I know Sarah. I think you should know that she hasn't been honest with you. I've seen her with someone, a man, late at night, more than once. I'm only telling you this because I think you deserve the truth." There were no details, no name, no return address, just those words, like a whisper from the shadows. I reread the email 3 times, feeling my hands start to shake. This couldn't be real. Who would go out of their way to send me a message like this if it weren't true? Why now? I didn't sleep at all that night. The words kept echoing in my head, bringing up every doubt I'd already tried so hard to silence. By the time morning rolled around, I'd made up my mind to find out for myself. This time, I wasn't going to let her brush it off. I needed answers. That night, Sarah had another PTA meeting. She said it casually over dinner, looking a bit rushed, as she packed up Emily and Max's lunchboxes for the next day. But I was watching her, noticing the way she avoided eye contact, the slight flush in her cheeks when she told me she might be home a little late. I nodded, swallowing my suspicions and playing along. I watched her walk out the door, saying goodbye with that same strange smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The moment the door closed, I grabbed my keys and followed her, staying back far enough to avoid detection. This was new territory for me, sneaking around, acting like some sort of detective. But I had no other choice. The email had left me with no peace. She drove straight to the school, as she said she would, but instead of parking out front, she took the long way around, pulling into a secluded spot near the back entrance. I stayed hidden in my car, peering through the dim glow of the streetlights. The parking lot was almost empty save for a handful of cars, including Principal Riley's black sedan parked a few spaces away from hers. I watched as she got out of the car and walked toward the school entrance. The air felt thick, like a storm was building. My heart was pounding in my chest as I waited, still clinging to a shred of hope that maybe this was all innocent. Maybe she really was just helping out late, working alongside a coworker who'd become a friend. Minutes ticked by. I sat there, staring at the glow of the school's back hallway, hoping I'd see her emerge any minute now, casually heading back to her car. But nothing happened. After an hour, I finally got out of my car. I walked carefully to the side of the building, searching for a window that wasn't too high up. I didn't know what I expected to see or find, but I couldn't just sit in my car anymore, not when I felt like the truth was somewhere inside those walls. There was a window near the gym that looked in on the back hallway. Through the slats in the blinds, I saw dim lights spilling from a doorway and voices carrying from inside. I crept closer, careful to stay in the shadows. The voices were low, but unmistakable. One was Sarah's, sounding soft and hushed, and the other was Riley's. "Are you sure he doesn't know?" Riley asked, his voice almost a whisper. "No," Sarah said, a tremble in her tone that made my blood run cold. "I've been careful, I promise. I feel so guilty about all of this. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." My stomach twisted as I tried to process what I was hearing. There it was, confirmation of everything I'd been dreading. "You're just stressed," Riley replied, his voice soothing, as if he'd done this 100 times before. "But I'm here for you. You know that, right?" I saw Sarah reach out, and he took her hand, drawing her close. They stood there, inches apart, her face tilted up to his, her expression torn between fear and something I couldn't quite place. Watching them like that was like watching my life slip out of my grasp. Then, out of nowhere, Riley reached for her and kissed her, softly at first, then deeper. I turned away, bile rising in my throat as everything inside me screamed to look away, to run. The sound of my foot hitting the ground jolted me back to reality. My mind raced as I stumbled away, my heart slamming against my ribs. I tried to keep calm, walking as quickly and quietly as I could back to my car. My vision blurred with anger and betrayal. I barely made it through the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, standing there like some forbidden romance from a cheap movie. The betrayal felt like a raw, open wound, and I was caught between rage, heartbreak, and a sick, hollow ache that I couldn't shake. By morning, I had made up my mind. I couldn't go on pretending anymore. I needed answers, and this time, I was going to get them. I waited until she came down to the kitchen, groggy and a little surprised to see me up so early. She gave me a warm smile, leaning in for a kiss, but I turned my head away. Her smile faltered. "Is something wrong?" she asked, a note of worry creeping into her voice. I took a deep breath, looking her square in the eyes. "Yeah, actually, there is. I need you to tell me the truth, Sarah." She blinked, her expression shifting to confusion. "The truth about what?" I could feel my temper flaring, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I followed you to the school last night," I said, my voice low and steady, even though I could feel my pulse pounding in my head. "I saw you and Riley." Her face went pale, her eyes widening as she stumbled back, looking like I'd just hit her with a sledgehammer. You followed me," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, not breaking eye contact. "Yeah, and I saw everything." She covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears, but I wasn't about to let her off that easy. "Why, Sarah?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of my own hurt. "How long has this been going on?" She looked down, her shoulders trembling, before finally meeting my gaze. "A few months," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "It started after that PTA event. We were just talking, and it felt nice to be seen. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Seen? Sarah, I've been here. I've always been here. And you know that." Her face crumpled, and she nodded, wiping away a tear. I know, it was selfish, and I'm so sorry. I don't know. I was feeling lost. The kids, the house, the daily grind. It all felt like too much, like I was losing myself. And then there was Riley, someone who didn't see me as just mum or wife." Her words twisted the knife deeper, but I forced myself to keep listening. "So what?" I asked, the anger rising in my voice despite my best efforts. "You thought he was some kind of escape?" She winced, looking away. "It wasn't like that at first. I thought it was just harmless, but—" Her voice trailed off, and she took a deep breath before meeting my gaze again. I didn't know how to stop. I wanted to scream, to let all the rage and pain pour out, but I knew that wouldn't change anything. I just stared at her, wondering how the woman I'd known for so long, the mother of my kids, could betray me so easily. I was about to walk away when she suddenly spoke again, her words rushing out like a dam had burst. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to tell you this, but the email, the one that you got, about us, it was from him, from Riley." I froze, her words echoing in my head. "What?" "He wanted you to find out," she admitted, her face contorted with guilt and shame. "He thought if you knew, we'd break up. He wanted to be with me, but he knew I wouldn't leave unless you found out." My blood ran cold as her words sank in. This wasn't just an affair. It was a setup. Riley had wanted me to know. He'd planned it, calculated every move, all to push me out of my own family's life. The weight of it all hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt something inside me snap. I could barely process what she'd just told me. Riley wanted me to find out. He wanted me gone. The fact that he deliberately orchestrated this betrayal, treating me like some obstacle he could just sweep aside, well, that changed everything. I stood there, staring at Sarah, my emotions boiling to the surface. "So you're telling me he's been stringing you along, and the whole time he's been planning to destroy our family?" Her head was bowed, shoulders slumped, and she nodded. "He said he was in love with me," she whispered, her voice cracking. I know how stupid that sounds, but I believed him. I didn't realize he was playing me too. Anger surged through me, stronger than ever. "You know, you talk about losing yourself, but did you ever think what this would do to me? To the kids? Or were we just collateral in your midlife crisis?" She flinched, and for a moment I thought she'd lash back, but she just looked defeated, her face a mixture of shame and regret. "I don't have any excuse," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I was selfish, and I let him get into my head. I thought I could keep it separate from us, from our family, but he wanted more." I turned away, trying to pull myself together. I couldn't look at her right then. It was too much. All I could see was the life we'd built being ripped apart piece by piece, and then I knew what I had to do. "Fine," I said finally, my voice quiet but steady. "You're going to tell him it's over tonight, and I'll be there to make sure he knows it." Her eyes widened in shock, but she nodded, as if she expected nothing less. We both knew this couldn't end in some quiet goodbye, not after everything he'd done. That night, I followed her to the school, a place that had once been part of our family's daily routine, but now felt like hostile territory. She parked near the side entrance, the same spot I'd seen her go in before. I stayed in my car for a few minutes, watching her gather herself before heading inside. She looked back at me through the windshield, her eyes pleading, but I offered no comfort. She'd made her choices. I followed her inside, careful to stay far enough back to let her go alone, but close enough that I could hear. I didn't have to wait long. As I stepped quietly through the dim hallway, I heard her voice, a low murmur coming from the administrative office just ahead. Riley's voice followed, smooth and too confident, as if he had no idea I was only feet away, listening. "So you're here," he said, his tone self-assured. "I didn't think you'd come." "You've got it all wrong," Sarah replied, her voice shaky but resolute. Whatever this was, it's over, Riley. I made a huge mistake." A pause, then a quiet chuckle from him. "Come on, Sarah, we both know you don't mean that. He's not here to save you, is he?" And that's when I stepped forward, letting my footsteps fall heavily against the polished floor. Riley's head snapped up, his face morphing from confidence to shock as he saw me standing there in the doorway. "Oh, I'm here," I said, my voice low, barely able to keep my rage in check. "Surprised?" He froze, his face a mixture of fear and calculation, and then he gave me a condescending smile. "This is between Sarah and me, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't complicate things." I took another step forward, fighting the urge to wipe that smug look off his face. "No, Riley, it's very much my business. You went out of your way to make it my business, didn't you? Sending that email, playing your little games. You tried to destroy my family." His face faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Look, things happen in life," he said smoothly. "Sometimes people outgrow each other. Sarah and I, we have something real. You should respect her choices." "Her choices?" I nearly laughed, though there was nothing funny about any of it. "You manipulated her. You used her insecurities to get what you wanted, didn't you?" He sneered. "Maybe if you'd paid more attention to her, she wouldn't have been so receptive." It was like he'd lit a match in a room full of gasoline. I lunged at him, grabbing his collar and slamming him against the wall. He grunted, his eyes widening as he tried to wriggle free. "You think you can walk into my family's life, ruin everything we have, and just walk away?" I growled, my face inches from his. "That's not happening." "Stop!" Sarah's voice broke through, and I felt her hand on my arm, trying to pull me back. "Please, don't make this worse." I let go of him, stepping back and trying to steady my breathing, but I didn't take my eyes off Riley. He straightened, rubbing his collar, and he forced a smug smile. "This is pathetic," he sneered. "Both of you." "Listen to me carefully," I said, my voice low and deadly calm. "You stay away from my wife, from my family, and from my kids. If you so much as look at any of us, you'll regret it." Riley gave a scoff, shrugging off my words, but I could see the fear behind his eyes. He was finally beginning to understand that I wasn't bluffing. As Sarah and I left the school, she walked beside me, quiet and subdued, her face tear-streaked and pale. But I had nothing left to say to her. I'd gotten my closure, and now I was done. When we got home, the weight of it all crashed down on me. It was over, but nothing would ever be the same. The life I'd thought we'd shared, the love I thought we had, it felt hollow now, like it had been ripped apart beyond repair. We didn't speak that night. She went to bed, and I slept on the couch, staring up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the pieces of my broken life. The days that followed were like moving through a fog. We avoided each other in our own home, barely exchanging words beyond what was necessary for the kids. I didn't know how to look at Sarah without feeling betrayed and hollow. I was drained, the anger settling into a numb acceptance that the life we'd built was fractured beyond repair. Sarah, though, was different. The once confident woman I'd married was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized, quiet, pensive, as if the weight of her actions had finally sunk in. She tried, in her own way, to make amends. She'd leave notes on the counter, small apologies scribbled on scraps of paper, or quietly offer to do things for me, like picking up my favourite groceries or handling all the errands. But the hurt ran too deep, and every little gesture only reminded me of what she'd done. One night, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, twisting her hands together. She'd tried talking to me several times, but I'd always brushed her off. This time, though, there was something in her eyes, an intensity, almost desperation, that stopped me. "I know I've ruined us," she started, her voice trembling. "But I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I lost myself, and I let someone else tell me what I wanted to hear because I didn't know how to find it in myself anymore. I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm so sorry." I listened, not quite able to look at her. Part of me wanted to forgive, to try to rebuild something from the ashes, if not for us, then at least for the kids. But another part of me felt like that would be a betrayal of my own dignity. "You know I would have done anything for you," I said quietly, finally looking at her. "But what you did, it destroyed that trust. I don't know if I can come back from that." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know. And I understand if you can't. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, even if that means letting you go." We sat in silence, the weight of her words hanging between us. I couldn't bear to say the final words, to sever the last thread that held us together, even if it was just by a memory of what we'd once had. But then something happened that neither of us could have foreseen. It was a week later when I got a call from the school board. They needed to meet with me about a situation regarding Principal Riley. Confused and wary, I showed up the next morning, where I was led into a small, sterile conference room. Sarah was already there, sitting with her head down, along with 2 board members and a woman I didn't recognize. She introduced herself as a legal representative for the school district. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Shaw," she said, gesturing for me to take a seat. "We wanted you both here because this pertains to your family directly." I exchanged a glance with Sarah, who looked equally puzzled, then back at the representative. She cleared her throat, flipping open a file. "There's been an investigation into Principal Riley's conduct. He's been dismissed from his position following several complaints." I felt a jolt of surprise. "Complaints?" "Yes," she continued, glancing at Sarah. "It appears that his relationship with Mrs. Shaw was not an isolated incident. We've since discovered that he had a pattern of manipulating other women in similar ways, using his position to take advantage." A heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah's face drained of colour, her expression one of disbelief mixed with horror. I felt sick as the realisation settled in. Riley had been doing this for years, targeting women like Sarah, who were looking for support, for escape, and using their vulnerability for his own gain. "We've contacted the authorities," the representative continued, "and while it's unclear if there will be any legal repercussions, he will no longer be employed in any educational capacity. We wanted to make sure you both were aware, as this situation is complicated." As we walked out of that meeting, Sarah was silent, her face a mask of devastation. Outside, she finally looked at me, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't know. I really thought he cared. I thought he was someone I could trust." I stared at her, and for the first time since all of this started, I felt a glimmer of something like understanding. She had been manipulated, used. Yes, she'd made her choices, but Riley had orchestrated it all, preying on her, weaving his way into our lives. It didn't erase the pain, but it added a new layer to my understanding of what she had gone through. That night, for the first time in months, we sat together in the living room, the weight of everything finally sinking in. We talked long into the night, stripping down every raw feeling, every moment of heartbreak and betrayal. She told me about the loneliness, the doubts she'd buried, and the parts of herself she had lost. And I told her about the hurt, the anger, and the pieces of me that felt shattered beyond repair. It was painful, and nothing about it was easy. But as the night wore on, I found myself letting go of the anger, making room for something else. Maybe it was compassion, maybe it was forgiveness. I didn't know what would come next, or if we could ever fully heal from this, but I knew I wanted to try. The next morning, I told Sarah that I was willing to work on things, but only if we went to counselling, if we laid everything bare and rebuilt from the ground up. And for the first time in months, I saw a spark of hope in her eyes. The journey wasn't quick or simple, and there were days when it felt like we'd never make it. But little by little, we began to stitch together the torn seams of our lives. The scars were there, and they'd always be part of us. But in time, they became reminders, not of the betrayal, but of what we'd overcome. Months later, as we sat together on the porch watching the kids play, I felt something I thought I'd lost forever, a sense of peace. Life didn't look the way I'd imagined it would, but we were moving forward, together, and for the first time, that was enough.